Hello and welcome to the next edition of the Weichert Report's video blog. My name is Brandon Weichert, founder and CEO of the Weichert Report, and this is your world. Tonight we're going to discuss the impact of long-term declining fertility rates. Now, it's funny, I've been alluding to this trend in other video blogs and other articles I've been writing, not just at the Weichert Report, but also at AmericanGreatness.com and other places as well. But I've never really spoken specifically to it. And in fact, whenever I do allude to it in my other work, invariably I'll get people on social media or emails from fans saying, "Why are you so focused on fertility rates? Who cares?" Well, I don't know if I've just not been clear enough, and so that's why I'm doing this next video blog. Basically, fertility rates are kind of everything. um, in economics, we talk a lot about human capital, and indeed, in many respects, and I don't mean to sound trite here, but in many respects, everything that we do in public policy and economics, political science, hard sciences, it doesn't matter. Whatever we as human beings do, it is always about humanity, about human beings. Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, rightly identified the correlation, that there was a positive correlation between large, growing, healthy populations of human beings and economic output and prosperity. And the subsequent studies and subsequent analyses over the generations have proven that the more youthful and numerous a country's population is, the more innovative it will be, and just overall, the more long-term prosperity you'll have. And what we're witnessing in the world, and it's not just in the West, we talk all the time about Western fertility rates, and indeed, the West is leading the pack, but overall fertility rates around the world are declining, or they are set to decline very soon. And when they do start to decline, they will decline precipitously. In the West, we'll just start out with kind of what everyone sort of already knows and what we've already talked about, just as a kind of refresher. In the West, since about the 1970s, you've had this tapering off of fertility rates. And there's a litany of reasons for this, but generally speaking, the cost of living in the Western world and the quote unquote first world, which I hate that term because it's Marxist it's a Marxian term. Third world is as well. I don't like those terms. So the developed world and the developing world is what I prefer to use if I have to use any distinction. So in the developed world in the West, you've suffered through declining fertility rates since at least the 1970s, and high cost of living, the kind of movement of people from the countryside to generally the cities, the major metropolises. You've had automation, increases in automation, which is having deleterious impacts on employment for regular old folks. You've got globalization driving a lot of this, which is causing jobs to be offshored, which in turn is removing economic opportunities for people. And if you don't have economic opportunities, it's likely that you're not going to have children. And if you do have children, it's going to have a litany of other negative side effects on the rest of society. So there are all these kind of trends afoot that have been spurred by the modern, global economy in the West. And litany of writers. You've got more kind of more partisan pundit type writers who are nonetheless very smart. Mark Stein has written in 2007, I believe, his book America Alone came out. Walter Laqueur, Laqueur, brilliant guy, European, who wrote The Last Days of Europe. Uh, you've got a litany of writers, and we'll link to them in the description of the video. But a litany of books and a litany of writers who've come out and kind of analyzed, particularly for Europe, the loss of fertility rates among native-born populations. And so, since the 70s, we've seen this happen, and in order to offset this decline in fertility, the Western countries have begun importing low-wage workers. In Europe, it's coming. These individuals are coming from much of the former colonies, European colonies in the developing world. So places like the Middle East, South Asia, Africa. They're bringing with them the politics of their homelands, which, comparatively speaking, ever since the Bandung Conference in the 1960s, late 50s, early 60s, the politics of the developing world was radicalized by Marxism and anti-colonial rhetoric during the Cold War. So they were bringing in people who do not share Western values per se, as well bringing people from the Middle East and South Asia who are likely Islamist or who will eventually have sympathies with the more radical Islamist movements that are sweeping across much of the world. Um, in America, we're seeing the influx of Central American and Mexican um, low wage workers coming in. All of this has the immediate impact of keeping economies moving, because as the older generation retires and dies out and the native born population behind them are not numerable enough to be able to support the older generation, we can at least rely, in theory, on immigrants coming in. Of course, that has come with a litany of other issues. For starters, in Europe, we've seen the differing cultures do not mesh well with the native European culture. There are riots, domestic unrest, social instability. On top of that, in both Europe and America, the immigration going on today is quite dissimilar from what our grandparents experienced, in that the immigrants come to these countries, particularly the low skilled workers, and they not only are depressing wages for native born workers, they're not only taking the jobs of native born workers, but they're also coming and signing up for already overburdened entitlement systems. So they're getting these payoffs, and then they normally send a chunk of their money and a chunk of what they make from the government subsidies back to their homelands, back to their family and their homelands, in the form of remittances. And so, and of course, the standard of living is so much lower in their homelands that the little amount of money they get from the government and the little amount of money they make doing their jobs, it's a lot of money back home. They can live very well, and their families will be taken care of. So this is kind of the short term, but obviously with the negative cultural side effects, with the inability, particularly in the case of Europe, and the inability to integrate these new people there, it's causing a litany of other security concerns, a litany of other actually economic downturn and economic concerns. But what they found is, even with immigrants, even if you had a completely open border policy, the problem is when you bring in new people and absorb them into the modern culture, after a generation, the immigrant fertility rates decline as well. And so you have overall this decline in human capital. In order for a society to be prosperous, most demographers agree that you need to have a fertility rate of 2.1 children per 1,000 women. That's the total fertility rate. The West has been well below 2.1. In the United States, we have been exactly at 2.1. Now, the reason the US has been at 2.1 exactly, societal replacement level has been maintained, but there is very little margin of error um, in the current number. The reason is because of immigration, but also, as Mark Stein details in his book, it's cultural. If you break down fertility rates according to each state, if you separate the individual states into two groups, the so-called red states and blue states, the states that are generally more conservative and the states that are generally more leftist or liberal, you find that the fertility rate, if you were to remove the red states from the equation, the fertility rate would be that of Europe's, any of the European countries, which are well below 2.1. Stein and others have posited that this is because of socially liberal policies that has exacerbated the uh, inability to maintain high numbers of offspring in these countries. Now, as I noted, the West is at the forefront, and we include Japan and South Korea and many of the Asian states in this as well. Any country that is oriented toward the West, any country that has embraced modern capitalism, the modern globalized system, we're seeing this general slowdown in fertility rates. And by the way, we're also seeing it in China. So we're reaching a point where the humans alive today and in the next decade or so will continue to be probably the largest cohort of people that have ever lived on the planet. It's true, I think. Generally, they're probably maybe a little too high in those estimates, but generally speaking, that's true. Well, that's because it takes about 18 years for someone to be born, to grow up, and become adults. The question is the people coming behind that cohort, are they anywhere near as numerous as uh, the people currently alive? And the answer is so far, the numbers are not indicating that they will be. And the problem is you have twofold. So, from a capitalist outlook, you need people to do work, to produce things, to generate income, to grow the economy. Everything's about people. Um, and if a society's not having enough babies after a protracted period of time, everything will start to slow down. Everything will start to decline. That's just the nature of things. And then on the other side, you have on the more kind of social democratic side, you have the entitlement system, which is throughout the West. It is completely bloated, completely overburdened, and now you're throwing in as I noted, you're throwing in migrants and immigrants and all of these individuals coming into the countries in Europe, in the West, in Europe, in the United States, wherever, coming into these countries, and then they're adding themselves onto the scrolls, and so onto the rolls rather, and so you've got these kind of twin. You've got low economic growth, high burden, uh, bad policies, and this is leading to the slowdown. And then you throw in technology, and we're developing technology, automation, we're relying more and more on interconnectivity through the internet and the like, all because, in large part, at least in the private sector, because there aren't enough people. and the people we do have are so highly skilled, particularly in the West, that they cost a lot of money. And the lower skilled workers, at some point, the process of production has become so advanced that at some point, the lower skilled workers are no longer useful to the companies, to the private sector. So they're embracing automation. It's very telling that in California, about 5 or 6 years ago, I saw a really interesting 60 Minutes documentary or segment in which they were interviewing people from Caltech who had developed or were developing automated um, fruit pickers, basically, the automated to do the work that the current Mexican illegal, in many cases, migrants are doing in California. These machines that they're developing, and it was at Caltech and I think also at Berkeley, but it was in California they were doing this. Basically, will render, if they ever take off beyond just the prototype stage, they will render, which I suspect they will render illegal immigration useless. There won't be any economic reason for the illegal immigrants to come here other than acquiring the entitlements from the overburdened entitlement system. And so these declining trends have encouraged automation. And automation has depressed people's productivity to such a point that they don't want to engage in the usual, human affairs. They don't want to have kids. They're putting off child rearing. And you've got all of these things that are kind of disincentivizing the creation of healthy human capital. Um, So much so that George Friedman said in The Next 100 Years, his great 2009 book, I recommend everybody get it. He was the founder of Stratfor, and now I believe he's doing something else geopolitical related. He indicated that in his research, in his estimation, the mushroom cloud, the mushroom cloud that was the demographic chart when the baby boomers were born, is returning to a more conventional pyramid. And that in my lifetime, we will see a return to that more kind of traditional human level of the pyramid shape of a demographic chart, as opposed to this kind of mushroom of a cloud of people that the baby boomers represented. And while this will have certain positive effects, for instance, he speculated that this could actually reduce the carbon footprint of humanity to such a point that anthropogenic climate change, if you agree with that belief, if you believe in that, which evidence suggests there's something going on, but that's another video blog. But whatever, if your concern is carbon pollution, fewer people will mean less carbon output, at least in theory. If you are concerned about, for instance, the overburdened uh, entitlement system, well, fewer people in the long run will mean less of a burden. Of course, it also means less money going into the system because there's fewer people, which is an interesting theory on his part. The problem right now is that these negative trends, and you can really blame the baby boomers, because the baby boomers were the kind of first generation in their youth who really pushed globalization, who really pushed these more socially liberal policies throughout the West, not just in America, but throughout the West, that became the dominant kind of paradigms in our political systems. And these trends have now all kind of coalesced to the point now where we're in this almost endless tailspin in terms of demographics in the West. And it's a thing where our modernity, our advanced system, is actually, in a way, the harbinger of our self-destruction. And so let's look down at the emerging, or rather developing market, the developing world. They are blessed right now with much higher fertility rates. There's a youth bulge right now, and this explains the Arab Spring. In fact, the demographics of the developing world, for the most part, are inverted to what they are in the West, in the developed world. And it's just really interesting how you're seeing these demographic shifts driving everything. Not just economic development, it's driving politics, it's driving everything. Scientific development, modernity itself is being driven by demographic shifts. The Arab Spring, a large part of that, a large fuel for that fire, was the youth bulge in the Middle East. It's wild stuff. Russia is behaving as it is because, in large part, the Russians, Vladimir Putin, is insistent on reestablishing Russian dominance or hegemony in its what it calls its near abroad. And part of that is because he wants to acquire more human capital to keep, as we've noted on many video blogs on the Weicker Report, to keep Russia's economy going. And so he's targeting places like Ukraine, which have, large numbers of ethnic Russians, as kind of, he wants to bring them back into the Russian fold because it takes a little bit of time to make babies, to raise stable children, to have those children grow up into functional adults. And so in the interregnum, he's got to do something to beef up the fertility rates, to beef up the population density, the human capital of Russia. It's really wild. In many ways, I would argue this anti-globalist, globalization, nationalistic, generally right-wing reaction that's fueling politics today, sweeping across Europe, swept across America, is in large part predicated on demographic shifts. And it's very telling. It's very interesting. And so when you can't just look at population density because that doesn't tell you long term. You can't listen to people like Paul Ehrlich, and the kind of the Malthusian theories that, well, we're going to have permanently enlarged human populations that's going to put an undue burden on the already, constrained natural resources of, planet of, spaceship Earth or whatever he calls it. You have to look at fertility rates. You have to look at fertility rates. And so in the developing world, you have a youth bulge. You have their political systems not able to embrace this youth bulge, not able to put these young people to work. There's not enough jobs, not enough opportunity. They're turning to radicalism in many cases, although I am not making a jobs for jihadis argument. I'm just saying that these trends are playing into a lot of what's going on. But eventually, as we see in China, even the most stringent, illiberal, developing economies, although I think to call China developing, that's another case, another argument for another video blog. But you're seeing, in much the same way when you get second-generation immigrants in places like the US and Europe, where their fertility rates start mirroring the native-born populations, in which it's a significant drop-off, decline, fertility rates for them. You're seeing the same thing play out on a larger scale in the developing world. So it is projected that if trends persist, which I don't know why they wouldn't, if trends persist, you're going to see this current crop of youth bulge going on throughout the emerging and developed world. As they get older, they're going to have their countries and their regions will become more modern for the most part compared to where they are now, probably. I'm generalizing. And as they become more modern, they're going to have fewer children. So while the West may be near extinction in terms of its native born populations by the middle of the century, you're going to have similar fertility rate patterns appearing in the once large, youthful population centers of the developing world. And so you're going to have a slowdown there. Now, we are without a doubt living in the political paradigm established by the baby boomers, particularly we in the West, specifically the United States. There's little doubt. In their youth, they set all of this into motion with the protests and the radicalism and the new left and all of that. Everything has played out from, you could say Kennedy, but most definitely from 1968 onward, has been the politics of the baby boom generation. As Michael now isn't about millennials, it isn't about Gen Xers. This is the politics of the baby boomers. The old saying that, when you're young, you're a liberal, and when you're old, you become a conservative. Well, it's kind of like that. The baby boomers have moved increasingly to the right. These nationalist movements are products in large part, and they're choosing people for the most part to represent them who are of the baby boom generation. The baby boom generation is driving this thing. In their youth, they drove politics, and in their older age now, they're driving politics. In a way, I look at it as they're kind of correcting all of the imbalances they created. And so it's very interesting to see the politics of demographic shifts play out, not just in America and not just in the Western democracies, but throughout the world. In a way, the Trump presidency or the rise of Marine Le Pen in France, Brexit vote, the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland party, in a way, all of these movements are an implicit attempt to, correct imbalances in the West's politics. As fewer people come to be on this planet, as human capital continues to decline, I believe that the countries that will be best suited to survive in that period of, for lack of a better term, relative stagnation, will be the countries that have made the swing back to a more parochial policy of nationalism. Because globalization can no longer work if global human capital is constantly decreasing, which is what seems to be happening. And that is a byproduct of modernity, of modern liberalism. And there's no walking away from that. So when I talk about demography in all of my video blogs and my articles, it's because it is the centerpiece, it is the primary driver for every political change that has been going on since 1968. Do not doubt me, my friends. If you want to understand what's going on in the world, you need to follow not just demographic shifts, but you need to follow fertility rates. And you will see some really incredible things. For the Weichert Report, this has been a look at the politics of demographic shifts. I'm Brandon Weichert. Have a good night.